Hey everyone, before we get started, YouTube shows that only 30% of my viewers are subscribed to the channel, and we're getting pretty close to 1,000,000 subs. Subscribing is free and it helps me out immensely, so please know that it is appreciated. I hope you all enjoy the video. I was born in a small coastal town, the sort of place that never quite caught up with the times and where fear and superstition had much more weight than logic or science. Growing up, I'd always thought the place was dull, with little to do and way too much gossip. That belief followed me even well into my 30s, though then, working as a fisherman and hearing tall tales on a daily basis, I'd at least learned to keep my opinions to myself. The Salt Witch was one of the local myths, a powerful being who made bargains with people. Depending on your wish, you could walk out richer than a king, or lose life and limb before even blinking. You should not anger the Salt Witch. For most of the time, that was the town's version of the boogeyman, a story told to scare children into behaving. But it only took one too many bad fishing seasons on a harsh winter for people to start getting really serious about the witch, to the point that a raft would be sent to sea to appease her. I once watched that raft leave port for 6 years in a row, full of flower garlands and offerings that we'd better be keeping and pushed into the ocean by sailors far too stubborn to admit that it was pointless. A part of me always thought that it was stupid, until my mother got sick. Then I understood that sometimes you just need to believe in something. It was said that anyone who sought the Salt Witch out was either a fool or had nothing to lose. With not enough money to call a doctor and mom's almost a constant fever and strange fits, I despaired enough to fit in with the second category. I followed every story of her that I could find, from the common fisherman tales to increase in the obscure rumors, wandering through the port and long past the town's outskirts. For a time, that's all I did. Any time that I wasn't nursing my mother, I would roam around the coast on my little boat, only half working and barely sleeping. I did it for what felt like ages and was about to give up, until one day, I finally saw something moving just across the bay curve. The gaggle of children was the first thing I noticed once I had made my way back to shore. There were over a dozen of them in varying ages from infants to teenagers, picking shells and running and whatnot. Their laughter filled the air, fighting for space over the cries of the seagulls, and a curious toddler even wobbled his way to inspect my pants. "Don't run too fast now. Oh, sorry, sir. They go where they please." Then, by the edge where the waves met the sand, stood a solid, white figure. Lucy was a young woman of graceful features, with fair skin and hair cascading in waves down to her hips, pale as if made of the very sea foam that covered her feet. I had never seen an albino before, rare as the condition is, and her light cotton dress in the early morning glow made her seem almost ghostly. I don't quite remember what I was thinking at the time, but I had barely slept in over a week, and truth be told, I was barely keeping myself on my feet. No way that I would find it in me to watch out for any inhuman forces at play, or tests to deem me worthy. The first thing I did when I laid my eyes on her was mumble, "Help," and faint at her feet, almost flattening the toddler in the process. When I woke up, I was lying on a couch tucked under a thick blanket. The scent of flowers and food reached my nose, and I felt warm and comfortable for a whopping 2 seconds until my mind registered that I had no idea where I was. It seemed to be a very large house with its own orchard and a backyard, visible through the windows, and a foundation of stone and brick, rather than the woodsy style that I was used to seeing around town. I walked around a bit and over to what I guessed to be the front door. The building rested at the very top of the reef, standing just far enough from the edge and at such an angle that it and the trail that led up there couldn't be seen from below. But standing on the doorstep and looking through it, one could see the whole town stretching below our feet, its distant noise and chatter reaching us like whispers in the wind. The bell tower was the only clear sound from there, ringing its loud call out to the heavens. It was 8 in the morning. A gust of wind and vertigo hit me, and I quickly scooted back to my spot in the couch. There were children all around, eating breakfast or studying or going about their morning routine. None of them were reacting to my presence much though, either as if I wasn't there or I belonged there all along. I was wondering if whether or not I should get up the stairs and explore the upper floor of the house, when the pale girl that I had seen on the beach came over carrying a tray of food, fruits and jam, yogurt and a fresh loaf of bread. I took it as my cue to remain where I was. She set the tray down in front of me and let me take a few bites before asking, "What happened to you?" My mother was kicked out of home in her late teens. I don't know whether I was the very reason that she was kicked out or if my presence was the result of some less than fortunate encounter in a dark alley. The fact is, I was born, and we only had each other. She had raised me on her own until I grew old enough to start working too. It turned out that it was a lot easier to find a job when you're a man, and I did well enough that she could retire without us starving. But with all that considered, we barely got by. So when she got sick, and the usual home remedies weren't working, there wasn't much that we could do. We couldn't pay for a doctor, we could only wait for death. Or go meet the salt witch. So there I was. "I'm not a witch," she sighed, "but I'll see what I can do." Ideally, she said, if someone was sick, I should have brought the patient with me so she could give them a checkup in person. But Mom was bedridden, so it couldn't be helped. She couldn't go down to town with me either since the townsfolk all hated her. So instead, she asked me about my mother's symptoms. How bad were her fevers? Were there any obvious infections? Did she cough, and if so, were the coughs dry or wet? How well she slept and such. I described everything as well as I could, and then Lucy went into the kitchen. I could still see her sifting through bundles of herbs and empty bottles, clearing space on the counter before she remembered to close the door. I exhaled slowly, letting my shoulders relax while I waited. The salt witch myth was already around before I was born, but I have assumed Lucy's uncommon looks weren't the only occurrence throughout the generations. That it wasn't hard to think the rumors started when someone up her family tree had first moved in. I'm guessing maybe her grandmother or other older relatives. And I just realized that up to that point, buried deep beneath layers of skepticism and denial, I had been terrified. People had told so many horror stories about her. Some said she was fickle and cruel, rising the tides and controlling the weather. Others said that she was made of stardust and cobwebs, older than death and just as cold, and if you crossed her wrong, she would turn you to salt. I had searched for her with my prayers said and ready to die, waiting for the town's bell to ring and to announce me gone in the morning. But she was just a woman who happened to look a little different from everyone in the place that she lived at, and they chose her as a gossip target. I wanted to throttle them. She came back from the kitchen with a flask and held it out for me to take. "How do I use this?" "A small drop every morning, and no more. It's pretty strong." I turned the flask around and checked it up close. It was the size of those cough syrup bottles that you would see at the drugstore, but without a label. The liquid had sloshed inside, tinting the clear glass walls with a coat of brownish black. The smell that hit me instantly, sharp and almost metallic with a faint note of charcoal in the background, and I had to reclose the lid as soon as I had opened it. In summary, the thing looked disgusting. "Sorry, I can't fix the taste," she stated quietly, her eyes fixed on me as I inspected the medicine. "But it can be taken with water or mixed with food." I nodded. still slightly disoriented by the smell. Her gaze bore into me until she noticed the toddler across the table was taking chunks off his breakfast bun and dumping them onto the floor. "Marcus, no. I don't like the little seeds. Then someone else can eat it. Don't waste food." I just sat there, still trying to process reality while watching her circle the coffee table in a hurry. I had expected something more ominous, I guess. Like filling that vial with my blood and pavement once it was empty, giving up my firstborn in exchange, or anything along that line. Not a 3-second stare and rushing off to still a child's little hands. "And what should I give you in exchange?" She looked back at me and hummed in thought for a second. "How about you come over and help me with my siblings until your mother feels better?" Of all things, she wanted me to babysit. I was speechless for a while, and then let out a breath that I didn't know I had been holding. I can't believe people make so much stuff up, right? But even then, if everyone who met you died, you wouldn't have any more visitors, right? That would be bad, yes. She agreed, though judging by how her head had tilted in confusion, my dark attempted humor had flown over her head, likely for the best. That's how my routine came to be. When I woke up every day, I put a drop of medicine for my mom in the water by her nightstand and left. My afternoons were spent fishing at sea or selling my earnings at the market, and I came home in the evenings. But my mornings were spent at the house over the reef with Lucy and her family. The weeks stretched into months. My mother's health improved, but even after she had recovered, I still found myself following the same path towards that house, hiking the trail up the reef and rising along with the sun until the town's hustle and bustle was only faint background noise. Those mornings were my favorite part of the day, opening up the curtains and tidying the house, setting up the laundry, preparing breakfast together before finally waking up the kids. I had never seen a saffron flower before. Well, now you have. The spice part is just these red pistils in the middle. Seems so little, right? We would eat together and clean up, and then Lucy sat by the loom and taught the older girls to weave and make lace, while I would work out in the backyard garden with the boys and the little ones. Sometimes we would harvest things together instead, and she would mention more little things she knew about each plant. Or we would take all the kids and head down to the beach to let them play around on the shore. And that's when most of their contact with the townsfolk happened, from people looking for the salt wedge. Most wanted medicine, like what was given to me before. Others sought out advice or were content with little lucky charms that truly held nothing but sentimental value. Those things were exchanged for other things from the town like parcels of butter, honey, or fresh milk. Some people also bought the lace, and then there were less reasonable people, the ones who would walk up demanding her to change the weather to make them rich, and the ones who didn't listen when we told them to stop sending offerings in the ocean. Some people are just stupid, I guess, but they ruined our whole day. In the times that happened, it wasn't hard to head up the reef the following morning and find Lucy bundled up in her room, sighing up a storm. I think it was one of those mornings when it first happened. One day, I arrived to find the house quiet and her cocooned under her blankets. I didn't know what to do, so I just sat with her, occasionally breaking the silence, trying to tell jokes and mostly failing. Until at some point I sneezed and she started giggling and couldn't stop for a while. It was contagious too, seeing as I almost laughed until we both were leaning over and barely breathing. She leaned closer and kissed me, and we made love. I won't claim she was my first. Sometimes begging on the streets isn't enough to put food on the table, and before the seafaring trade proved to be an alternative, I had followed my mother in her own trade, and found a surprisingly wide market for that sort of thing. Older men who like younger boys, older women who like young boys, young women a lot more feisty than their parents knew, or less faithful than their husbands believed. But there was something so different in my time with Lucy. Still laced together long after the act and letting time trickle until we were late to wake the kids. I loved her. That was a fact. As simple as dawn breaking each day, even though I didn't notice until it was already too late to opt out. She was strange and beautiful, and I loved her, and I drank her presence like those lost in the desert would drink water. The townsfolk gossiped, as they always did. They said the salt witch had me enchanted, that we met in the darkest hours and did unholy rites. That's just how people are. Give them anything to blabber off, and in their minds, I'd soon be sailing to a foreign land on a stolen ship, whispering sweet nothings in the ear of a goat. I didn't mind the rumors about Lucy, and I didn't care about the whispers of the neighbors behind my back. They had never cared about us, so why should I? I didn't think that it should affect me. Well, that was careless. Maybe you could say it wasn't my fault, that the events that followed couldn't be predicted or were outside of my control. To suppose you'd be right. But I still wonder who left the door open. It might have been my mother, leaving for a stroll or groceries and forgetting to close it on her way. Or it might have been me who didn't lock it when I left for work. Either way, it didn't change the fact that when I got home that evening, my mother was sprawled on the floor, silent and still. She couldn't even cry for help. Her fingers were slick with blood as she tried to close the gash on her throat with her own hands. For a moment, I felt my heart freeze. There he is, the one consoling with the witch. I barely reacted at the trespassers in my home, other than glancing at the one who stepped on my mother's body as they surrounded me. Their voices were like white noise. My own breathing was too loud in my ears. What you looking at, creepy witch? I didn't respond. I wish I could tell you that I cried, that I sobbed and screamed for help and tried my best to help my mother. I should have. But I took in the cold truth of her limp body and half-lidded eyes, and the sight just left me numb. She was gone. She wasn't the best mother in the world, and I wasn't the best son either. But she had birthed and raised me the best that she could, and she was gone. And I only saved myself. When they surrounded me, I grabbed the first thing that I could get a hold of and slammed it on the skull of the nearest person that I could hit, making them stagger backward and opening a path for me to flee. They lunged at me. Something stung my sides, but adrenaline kept me going enough to slip away. They came after me and I ran. But to where? My legs made the decision before my mind even registered where I was going. That little voice of my conscience just told me to run or I was going to die. And I kept running to put more and more distance between me and the ones chasing. My mind was blank, barraged by so many thoughts that they had fused into nothing. And my memory is a blur between running the trail up the reef and the moment I was already crossing the front door, slamming it closed behind me. Something felt different in there. Dark, empty. Like what lied beyond the house's threshold was not the place I had been in every morning for the past couple of years. I expected it somewhat, from having walked in the middle of the night. But no one rose up with the commotion that I made. There were no care holders where I expected to find them to light up. Most of the trinkets and the furniture were gone. The lacy curtains, the children's toys. The children, my Lucy. They were all gone too. I couldn't understand. Had the townsfolk got to them first? No, most people didn't even know how to get there, and it shouldn't be possible to hollow up the house and transport all the furnishings in that hour, even less without making any noise. My heart throbbed with pain and confusion, and so did my stomach as my insides tried to function despite the trail of blood still escaping the wound at my side. There was no one to help me, and I was alone. No, it was a good thing. It was too late to regret it. But the truth is that if the townsfolk didn't lose track of me, then I had just led an angry mob into the home of a single woman and over a dozen young children. It was good they weren't around. I stumbled into the backyard, my darkening sight finding no trace of the carefully tended orchard, while I rested my back against the husk of what I remembered as a verdant tree. My strength was waning. That first rush of adrenaline was wearing off, and my eyes wandered to the open back door, from where I thought I could hear the townsfolk approaching. I looked up at the sky and cried. It was only then I realized what I was still holding. The bottle with my mother's medicine, still mostly full since she had stopped taking it soon. Somehow it hadn't been damaged by me smashing it on a man's head. The glass smooth and solid in my grab. I don't know how the idea came to me. It was almost instinctive. Or maybe it was the blood loss and not letting me think straight. I held my breath and checked the lid off, propped my back better against the tree, and I chugged it down. It tasted burnt, sour, and bitter and cold, and by all means it shouldn't help. Being sick with a bad fever and hallucinating and being stabbed in the belly were very different issues. But after the first gulp, my pain had lessened. After the second, the burning feeling on my side ceased completely, exchanged for the feeling of torn fabric tickling my skin. After the third gulp, I couldn't stop. How much was too much? No more than a drop. I drank the whole thing, and then relief became agony. It coated my insides like a layer of sap, clogging down my throat. I hetched and gasped for air, but I couldn't inhale anything. It stung, in my lungs and my stomach. Stinging ice spreading and taking over and chilling my veins frozen after searing through them. The bottle slid off my grasp and rolled onto the ground as I tried to just focus on breathing. And in the distance, the bell tower rang announcing midnight, and faintly, I wondered if the noise I heard along with it, the rush of little steps approaching, and childish whispers were real or just a fabrication of my dazed mind. I had the faint awareness of seeing a man stepping through the back porch, yelling, "Found him!" to someone behind, and a knife being raised. I lifted an arm to block it. "How dare you!" The words thundered above my head, spreading a wave of outrage, panic, and grief that almost drowned out my own. My sight went white, but not from passing out. It was like a flash grenade had exploded behind me, and I could see nothing but white-hot rings of light. And the whispers. It was like a legion of voices fused into a single one, and yet it had something familiar. Most of my pursuers never reached the orchard. I could hear them through the half-open door, along with Lucy. "What are you doing? Get out of my way. Stop it." They were here. Everyone was here. No, 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 no. I tried to get back up, rolling onto my stomach and dragging myself forward, but I could barely move. My fingers were numb with the cold. I couldn't breathe. My consciousness faded in and out, muddling everything together. The children in the backyard, the townsfolk still inside, and Lucy's voice begging for them to stop. "Why are you in our house? Stop it. Let go, you creepy little. You're not welcome here. Stop it. You friggin' monster. Stop it." Everything was white, my sight, the sounds. White light and white noise. Fire and ice burning my bones. My consciousness faded. And then nothing. I woke up in the orchard, the early daylight fluttering weakly behind a cloudy sky. Rain poured from above and turned the earth into mud beneath me. Some water hit my face. It tasted strange, a little salty, almost bitter, though it might as well have been an aftertaste of the medicine. Getting annoying, it's the third trespassing already. I told you the entryway isn't working as is. We need a better system, longer passages, something. I'm hungry. The voices of the children filling my ears was the first sign that I was really awake again, instead of having some weird dream. I sat up, expecting to hurt all over, but I felt no pain. No bruising. No scratches from when I fell. No trouble breathing. The ground felt strangely soft beneath my legs. with none of the semi-sharp resistance that grass blades should have. My body was suddenly aware of every tendon and muscle that it had, and my eyes wandered to the garden plants, catching hints of colors that I had never seen in every petal and leaf. Something was wrong with me, but I couldn't see any wounds. Even the gash on my side and arm had closed, leaving the bloody tear in my clothing as the only indication that it had been there. No, there was something odd on my arm. I turned it to check the spot that I was hit with the knife from before, and a layer of my skin was flaking off like a bad sunburn, but instead of a stinging red beneath it, my exposed flesh was an intact layer of light gray, closer to clay than flesh in hue. I probably shouldn't pick at it, but morbid curiosity took over. A stripe of skin peeled off between my fingers like old paint. A jolt of panic took over and I tried to slap it back in place, but it didn't stick, and it slipped from my hand and onto the ground. So instead, I hurried to make a makeshift band-aid out of my own sleeve and keep it hidden. Thinking back, there was no pain or blood from that either, though the fright didn't let me notice it at first. It's like I really was coated with paint or glaze and I had ripped off bits of it. Well, there was no point in wallowing on the ground for longer. I stood up and tried to reorient myself, squinting to see through the thick rain. The children were all over the backyard, divided between their usual morning routine and dealing with the weather. Some ran back and forth, carrying the exposed firewood somewhere that it would stay drier. A few were fighting the clothesline in the wind, hurrying to fetch the hung clothes and sheets, and a couple of others held said clothesline poles in place. Ahead, shielded from the weather by the back porch, there was a group butchering what from my previous sitting spot seemed like a large pig. Now that was a rare sight. It was uncommon to have meat around the house as far as I had seen since most of their food came from their own backyard. But the methodic ease in which they had moved, breaking bone and cleaving flesh, indicated a good amount of practice. It seemed odd. I had walked half the way towards them before realizing that the feet of the pig didn't have 2 pointy toes each, but 5 rounded ones. There was a human body under the butcher knives. Naked, already headless, mostly bled out. A dizzy spell assaulted me and I had to lean against the wall to not fall down again. I almost fled again, if it not for a thought that had crossed my mind. Did you save me? Turning my head to the side kept most of the body outside my field of view. However, that pile of folded clothing and other discarded belongings that had been neatly placed to the side told me that this is what was made of my previous aggressor. Well, he was being super rude, one of them replied, running in uninvited and going stabby. No manners at all. Lucy got the others though. That meant I wasn't necessarily in danger, at least not right then. I inhaled and exhaled a couple of times and then took a few tentative steps towards them. My question had caught their attention, and I could feel their eyes on me as I approached, but it seemed they had no intention of stopping their current task. The sky was crying up a storm, and by the time I had reached the back porch and took shelter under its roof with them, I was already drenched to my very bones. "How are you even conscious?" they asked after a moment, giving me a bewildered look. Maybe he had some of it in him to begin with. Some of the oldies who came down here had kids, right? It made Father angry though. He was always angry, and it's been a while, so if it trickled down the line, it's not like it was going to be obvious. "I have no idea what any of you are saying," I sighed. Another of them waved a familiar glass bottle in front of me, like that it explained everything. The flask was as muddy as my head, but empty. "You drank it all, right? There's still some on your teeth." "You mean the medicine from your sister? It's blood, well, not human blood. I guess you would call it ichor." They looked at each other for support and then shrugged. "When you drink ichor, it becomes a part of you, imprints you with some of the old ones it bled from. So it's good for healing wounds and illness and such. but you shouldn't have too much without time to adapt first. Mainly not ichor from a high-rank source. Why not? It would hurt like hell and your mind might break. Well, it certainly did hurt like hell, no arguing with that, and I thought I was going to die. You're not surprised? About what? You thought we were all human, right? I guess I do have some questions, I admitted with a nervous chuckle. The children had caught me off guard, but I had a guess. I had come looking for their sister while following an old myth, after all. It's just, even if I knew that, some things are hard to accept until they hit you right in the face. And I had just lost the only blood family that I had last night. My stomach was tied into a semi-permanent knot, my heart both numb and stinging at the same time, while I tottered the line between denial and acceptance. But she was always a little different. Granted, she seemed more normal than the stories it told. Human enough to feel safe sitting at the same table, sharing the same food. Chatting and making plans while the kids chittered in the background. And yet, odd enough to not question when she took trays from the oven with her bare hands, or why it always seemed to rain when she looked sad or tense. So I knew, even if I didn't want to believe it, I knew it long before noticing the buildings and landscape seen beyond our windows didn't even exist in the town where I was born, or how for every appeasing raft the people sent to sea, there'd be yet another waterlogged crying bundle in the house to take care of, another little sibling, another offering. I knew and it didn't matter, not to me. She said she wasn't a witch and I trusted her. What time is it? It's morning, one said. It's always morning, another one quipped. I don't think you knew that either, the first one again. I had so many questions, but the kids were too distracted to answer more, busying themselves with the butchering duty, and I left them to it. I couldn't see Lucy anywhere, and what the past hours accounted for, I needed to find her. I needed to talk to her. And then I did find her in the living room, and I couldn't manage to say a word. She was standing in the middle of the room, staring at her own hands like they were something filthy. I couldn't see her face while from where I stood. Her hair was in the way. But there was pain in the tone of her voice, and the rain pouring outside and the slight trembling of her shoulders. Her lips barely moved, mumbling the same thing over and over. It took me a while to understand the actual words. I told you to stop. Why didn't you stop? Why? I briefly wondered why all the kids were in the backyard instead of with her, but they probably didn't know what to do, other than giving her space and making sure the daily chores would be done. There was no one else in sight. Only salt up the walls, salt piling on the floor, and salt statues all around. Curiosity led me to inspect the nearest ones. They were all pure white, except when I eyed the faces up close. Faint wet marks remained trailing down from their eyes. Red tears. I raised a finger to touch the stains then, though there was no point in the gesture. No sign of life was left in them, but the blood lining down their cheeks, forever frozen in their prison of salt. This wasn't witchcraft. Witches are humans with strange skills. She said she wasn't a witch and I trusted her. She couldn't be a witch if she's not human. I glanced at her from over my shoulder when I noticed I couldn't hear her mumbling anymore. She had turned slightly and was watching me, pale eyes locked into mine. I flinched. You're afraid of me. I'm not, I lied. Yes, you are. Her voice was a whisper fighting the wind that howled against the windows. The morning was cold, a gentle coolness despite the weather, silvery sunlight seeping through the glass panes and beneath my skin. Another white lie. What wasn't a lie? What was she? I had sometimes thought the way she looked at the kids and me bordered on weird, like she had expected us to shatter at the slightest touch. Maybe to her we would. How much did she have to suppress and smother down just so she would not turn us to dust with a glance? No one else was there to tell me otherwise, so I stepped closer, I had dreamed of whisking her away before, going somewhere else far, far from there. Now I knew that wasn't possible, but I just couldn't leave her like that, standing alone in that room, surrounded by empty shells while an anguished storm wailed outside. She froze for a second when I reached out before slowly easing into the embrace. I wonder what she thought that I would do, though clearly a hug was not what she had expected. Of course, somewhere in my mind, I knew my current course of action was not what most would have done. Maybe an idiot would have tried to fight her. Feeling the bitter black that flowed in her veins was enough to justify either killing her or dying trying. And most people would see the fate of the last ones who did try, and would have fled in horror. Yet I found the act of keeping her close gave me comfort, and helped me feel less alone. And I hope that the feeling was mutual. Because when I looked at her, I could see nothing but the girl I fell in love with. The girl who I knew the names of every urban weed but got sarcasm, as well as a child who would get quantum physics. Weird and quiet and sweet, with an inherent gentleness in everything she did that, for the life of me, I never managed to match. She was still the same, even while surrounded by bodies and with her own body pressed against mine, shivering in my arms. Her head was tucked against my shoulder, and I hid my face in her hair. It smelled of petrichor, ozone and earth, and dew on leaves, like the ghost of a garden. I was afraid, yes, but I never felt unsafe near her. You should go. That was my fear put into words, a sense that if I walked away and crossed that front door like so many times before, I would never see her again. But if I didn't leave now, I never would. She seemed so frail, not the fragility of a human or of life as I knew it, but of an ancient temple eroded by time and abandoned. I could feel the weight on her shoulders and the cracks weathering down her back. Weary, crumbling, and home. Leave. If not, I'll keep you here. That's fine, as long as I keep you too. We stood like that for a long while, hearing the sounds of the children going back to their routine around the house, the cries of the seagulls beyond the front door, and the distant noise of the town waking up with the day. They said the salt witch would demand a price for every wish, a pint of blood, your heart, your soul. She never asked for mine. I had shared it all on my own free will. Maybe it was naive and maybe it was stupid. Or maybe it was because drinking all that ichor had changed something in me. But I didn't care. I was exactly where I should be. The rain eased into a drizzle before stopping completely. The bell tower rang 12 times, and then silence fell as the world outside shifted into noon. And I remained in the realm where morn endures. I've lost count of how many years it has been since then. 100, 1,000, maybe more. Long before the little town had grown and became a city, and the city became ruins and time whisked away from its last remains from the realm of living. I don't regret my choice. Humans are fragile, whimsical, and stupid, tripping all over life and repeating the same mistakes over and over. But if you have anything in your favor, it's that, the innate ability to choose and change and create. You're always making the most amusing new things, like this iPhone thing with the internet. You can make heaven on earth if you would all stop fighting and killing each other over bullshit for 15 minutes. Until then, we'll remain as we are, waiting and watching. Our domain filters through yours, for the most part unnoticed, nested in spaces in between. In the corners, the light bends a little wonky. In unused rooms in abandoned buildings and the hollow of old trees. The rules to find us evolve with you, revolving around your faith and the tales you pass on. But our truth doesn't change. My name is Raheel, the Pathfinder, spouse to the Morning Star. I maintain the doorways between our realm and yours. If you find one, feel free to pay a visit. Sit down, have a drink, and share a story. But make sure to mind your manners and don't wear out your welcome. Don't be rude. I hold no care for your safety if you're rude. My family has a lot of mouths to feed, after all, and we don't waste food. For the morning is bliss, the afternoon's a charm, and evening's a delight. Be wary of what comes after, for the night is unforgiving and often a murderer in disguise. Journal found in the redigging of the Yucatan Peninsula cave systems. 18.8067 degrees north, 89.3985 degrees west. Steady temperature, 25 degrees Celsius maintained. 345 meters from inception, steep descent. June 20th, 1985. Visibility is getting exceedingly low after the first vantage point. Brittle limestone covers the precipice. Headlamps and spotlights flicker violently across some extreme locations from our initial starting point. Thermal scanners prove futile across these same unidentified areas. We are hovering around closely on the edges of our initial point. The only problem, palpable, is low visibility, due to some kind of nebulous fog sojourning around the edges. Wandering alone without carrying a multivariate analysis on the known surface is very dangerous, for few regions on the extreme westward side of the cave have almost acute declination and ghastly deformities. The cave roof tilts perilously close to the edges of these surfaces. The entrance to the cave was surrounded by few delirious villagers, complaining of perturbing the natural vegetation as translated by our local companion. Later, as we show no signs of retreating, our entreaties finally gave way. By then, we were already past our mark. However, the villagers chose to linger around the cave for unfathomable purposes, eventually retreating to their shacks on the outskirts as evening drew closer. Immediately, local workers working on the far ends of the cave system spotted certain distinct cave paintings. What proceeded next amused my senses to a great bit, for some workers were seemingly repelled by the prehistoric ramblings and immediately expressed wishes of abandoning that part of the labyrinth altogether. What frightened them to this extent, I knew scarcely of, for I was given the tedious responsibility of studying geometry. Hushed utterances of terrified workers filled the corridors. Some even compared the deities in the petroglyphs to the hideous Hindu god, Asteroid. Further in the corridors, our finds managers team, which consisted of 6 members including 2 students, suggested some great findings further ahead in the cave system. Furthermore, while progressing in the only direction hitherto suitable for trudging, one of these students from the Finds Manager Division reported back enthralling news. An unbelievable alcove-like structure was slightly visible. After moving linearly westward by hugging the cave walls for about 250 meters, these rock structures manifested into much greater sculptures entirely man-made. The revelation sent a wave of nervous exhalation. Immediately after carefully securing those artifacts, we contacted our site manager, Abigail, who, upon receiving the impeccable news, wasted no time in wiring our director and head of our division, who in turn congratulated us on our early success. Having been run on a sufficiently low budget, the possibility of finding something this perfect in a condition so early in an exploration was a rare occurrence, and it baffled our finds manager, Victor, to a great extent. Chances of a random cave-in were sufficiently low. Relative tundra was sufficiently on high altitude as well. Conversely, some parts of the cave, as scanned by our thermal scanner, revealed data of great interest. Some parts were sufficiently inside the cave, had a steady, almost acute declination in temperature, while others, like the area near our vantage points, show no such anomalies, and a linear declination in temperature was recorded. 18.8067 degrees north by 89.3985 degrees west. Steady temperature 21 degrees Celsius maintained. Abnormal variations around the trove and steep declination in the pit. 140 meters from inception. Steep descent. June 21st, 1985. The exploring team yesterday did a rather meticulous and tremendous job of exploring the much-dreaded westward side of the cave. And then, the only way past our deadline was 300 meters from our initial descent, where we were able to very safely gather some of the ostentatious artifacts. All the while, workers on the extreme ends of the perimeter recorded uncanny data. For a lichen-like substance, extremely slippery, and emanating a putrid smell adhered to the adjoining walls of the cave and much of the surface, making walking nearly impossible and a much more dangerous task. Precarious and rather intelligent rock structures on the far ends of the corridor were immediately identified and secured by workers. However, great precision and precaution had to be taken due to the alarmingly ponderous nature of the artifacts. As of the initial condition of the artifact, we were left wondering in awe of these seemingly ebony, impeccable stone structures. Not a case of mechanical erosion had affected them, and the impact of rolling or weathered erosion was absent throughout. The same gelatinous, slimy molds covered the entire region of the walls, near the sepulchre and much of the artifacts. Only a prolonged treatment of the various materials and structures, plagued by the unidentified sticky gelatinous substance, was needed in the laboratory. The presence of any kind of salt was rather astoundingly low, and this meant a low amount of salt crystal formation. Even today, some village folks gathered at the entrance to our dig site, but left much earlier. What their intention is, I have no clue of. After only a steady ascension of around 90 meters further westward, the limestone stalagmites got dangerously close and were distinctly visible. Some organic materials, similar to the ones around the initial trove, covered the precipice as well, and were only identified when one of the heavier materials had dropped, without any prior notice on Steekman's headgear. Careful investigation of the slimy mold gives us the idea of some kind of animal excreta, preferably mammals, for these placental creatures hovering around in limestone caves are a common occurrence. The only concern projected by Gavin, the geoarchaeology manager of our division, pointed out the low visibility, for visibility reduced drastically after 30 feet above us. Such darkness was impenetrable and rendered our 120-watt headlamps useless. Workers working in the far ends of the cave now started complaining vehemently of a noxious smell emanating from the queer sepulchre and from the great abyss. All the while, some other workers of our division complained of the same slimy, mold-like organic material dripping from the cave's precipice as well, while some even complained of a nauseating smell arising from the stone sculptures. Others reported a strange radiance and heat radiating from the same sepulchre, which harbored most of our miniature findings. After a careful thermal scan of the abhorred stop, as termed by some men of ours in extreme delirium, after even reporting seeing some voluntary movement in the miniature statues. Interesting details were recorded. The moldy, gelatinous-like materials covering the entire range of the cave walls on the west side, before the steep descent, itself radiated some sort of intense heat radiation. Long presence beside the alcove in the trove put some of our men, as well as the village folks, to extreme fatigue, and some even complained of nausea. Local workers from the surrounding villages spoke in hushed speeches no more, and presented their contempt in some foreign languages in sheer unison. Henceforth, the dreaded miniature statue of the seemingly and strikingly similar looking as of the abhorred Hindu deity Asteroid, as exclaimed by one of the more timid students from our fine manager's team. It was abandoned not only by the village folks, but even workers from our division discarded it for standing a trifle close to the portent aroused nausea according to them. Of this I cannot vouch, for their fear alone induced a feeling of obnoxious uneasiness and guaranteed an appreciable distance from the supposed specter. Now we must begin the fearful descent. Fearful not because I dread, but fearful because some of men of both from our division, as well as some of the village folks, repeat dreadfully of some accursed legend and the dank abyss that we must never set foot on. It is down there. We must find findings which will enhance our edition. It is down there that our real discovery awaits. In the dank corridors of this eon lost, centuries sealed and eon forgotten cave systems. Today, we must shun those who are delirious, fearful, or even skeptical, for we are only but a trifle away from unearthing a culture vastly forgotten and buried under thousands of years of weathered stone. 18.8067 degrees north by 89.3985 degrees west. Temperature unknown. Can't figure out anything else. Mental state is in doldrums. June 22nd, 1985. Fear is the mother of morals. Bear in mind closely that it is only the further cave-ins that I suspect and fear. Neither the groaning of that nameless entity, nameless for I have only a little recollection and knowledge of that, nor the wailings of my crew members deter or even frighten me. May God forbid us in our mad pursuit of the historic, for we displayed such dumbness and folly stupidity that I would not like to wish upon even my nemesis. Bear in mind one more thing, for even in my mad dash toward the inner sanctum of this cave, where I now reside, so blissfully aware of my imminent demise, I did not see any actual horror save for those eyes. There were hundreds of them, even more, oh God. Those eyes we witnessed those at the inception of our excavation, but such blinding faith, and under a prosaic spell of the dreary job, we were never to take something so spectral of a thing into account. I can't believe it. I can see these horrid eyes now, leering down at me and mocking me. The cave bellows in laughter, in a response to my own. Stupid, I would say. A stupid thing to do to further enrage a person, wholly drowned in its own seas of visual horrors his brain has to subject him to. I would now like to think of the village folks who joined in our blasphemous venture. For what? I can now understand their furtiveness when around those slimy materials and when around the hideous figurine of the Hindu deity Asteroid. They were the first to descend and the first to ascend. Such random and timely dismantling of a cave, may God forbid, shall not occur to any. The reason for the dismantling, I have no clue of. I am still unable to comprehend such a disastrous consequence, for very securely and tediously, we had begun our descent. And with utmost security, we began walking on the hideous surface. At first, I'm not sure. Details are fuzzy and blurry, why wouldn't they be? I just escaped the wrath of an unnameable entity, which is still wandering around these labyrinths, around these roofs, and around these horrid corridors. I think I might have enough of a deadline to document everything. Deadlines are imperative in our field of expertise. I might embark on my story, but as I say this, bear in mind just a trifle bit more. I might not be able to finish this, and if so, this journal is recovered under this impious debris. Men of science and fellow excavators alike will be tempted to discard and disregard, and might go on at length to even call this a hoax. But it is only with the grace of God, and on that mercy of that stupid being, that I am able to write this, and not under any circumstance that this journal might be disregarded, or be called a hoax, as it is clear and very straightforward, extractable from my earlier notes in the day of June 21st, on the edge of the Yucatan Peninsula. Today, we were meant to descend further in these secretive Mexican caves. Having previously secured various relics, we started further descent in a rather high spirit, save for some dubious village folks and some sick men from our division who were quite vehemently opposing the digging and even asked for a reshift. In the mad pursuit of unearthing ghastly secrets, we let nothing deter us, and even under the absence of a few workers, we descended down into the abyss. It was then I suspected something extraordinary of the most supernal nature at work. At first, some of the local workers shouted, followed by a scream of the most hideous kind. It was Matt, and his demonic screech is how I suspect something spectacularly supernatural was at play, for there resided in his guttural scream an awe of the most curious nature. For you see, there is a normal scream and a normal person's scream. That of a male, you don't go on to hear helplessness, dread, fear, curiosity, or even surprise, no. In that unnatural moment of panic, again I say, I wasn't subjected to any visual horror until the very end. At once I feared the worst. Only a singular question reverberated in my mind. How did this happen? I believe most of the men from our division and of the villagers, which we recruited immediately, perished under the falling debris. And if not then, the further excavation hazards must have secured their untimely demise. At some points, I even heard metallic clangs, curious thuds on metal pipes, steel plates falling, and then silence, the sound of settling debris, and the complex haze of confusion, fear, stupidity, and humor. Yes, even humor. I wouldn't want to lie, would I? It will only be suitable if I tell everything as it was and without any touch of mystery or exaggeration. The whole of the front portion of the cave descended down upon us. I'm not sure of any survivors, but in the distance beneath gravel, dirt, and debris, I can hear screams. But I can sense astonishment in their speeches as well. Only this was enough to deter me from even going beyond that hindrance, beyond that wall of debris. Note that if I was built like the Lord himself, or even had some supernatural powers of my own, even then, I would have floundered in front of those gigantic boulders covering my exit. And even then, to climb the steep wall, it would have been a drudgerous task in itself. I knew not what nature of spell came upon me, for in the face of death, call it my callous behavior or haughty demeanor, I was unnaturally calm, at peace even. What propelled me through the abyss, and furthermore into those hideous, away from our work area, into these dismal corridors of death, is anyone's guess. But to say that I escaped unscathed, well, that would be a lie. From fear from the delicate wound oozing a dangerous amount of blood from my head, I'm not entirely sure what caused me to faint, for it was as sudden and as quick as the collapse of our dig site. Sleep came as a deliverance, if only for a jiff, but in that merciful period of time, floating between maddening labyrinths of my transient days, I sought out many wonders than these cities' haze. Under a moonless sky, and in the vast, unfathomable plains of sheer nothingness, I met a singular deity, of whom I can describe with just visions and no lore. Only that ensued respite from my unending fright and nothing more. How would you deny the subconscious? Yes, the subconscious mind. How would you deny it? How would you deny the unceasing urge to explore what further these damn corridors held within them? Even when some inexplicable sound, as of some ancient monstrosity under unspeakable pain, was scarcely audible, the type of sound one wouldn't expect in a cave shunned off for 1,001 years. I found it impossible to deny the perpetual urge to seek what these dang caverns held and what they hid, for death was imminent, and the only way to seek merciful oblivion. First, I must tell you about the paintings that I saw. I like to believe that it was only the half luminescence of the flashlight and half shadow of my own body which fell upon those paintings and made them appear even more hideous. For you see, in my several years of being an archaeologist, only once before I felt extreme terror. Only once. Even then, I was in the merciful company of my fellow observers. But what I saw there was a complex mixture, a disproportionate compound of everything that is unwelcoming, unwholesome, and ghastly. What are these paintings but only a reflection of the culture, only a reflection of their dreams and their thoughts? From what I have gathered from the innumerable accounts that I've read, of the numerous books I have galloped in my years of erudition, only scarcely I have witnessed painting depicting true fear, unadulterated terror. From what I saw, I could only derive this singular conclusion. Years ago, I'm quite unsure about it because, in a normal chain of events, uranium-thorium dating would have been conducted on these specimens as well as these rocks to find out the exact age. This cave art, I believe, must go as far as 24,000 years old. And the very first of these prehistoric arts that I stumbled upon, it was all but a representation of a ritual altar inside similar-looking caves and not much queer. Further up the cave wall, another one of these petroglyphs show what must have been some kind of enormous mammal, but its entire anatomy, I'm not in a position to derive conclusions from these paintings, was queer. For although its enormous size, its wings, as in the art, was of even greater stature, its shape was very uncanny, cloud-like, and it was levitating. An animal or bird I can't quite fathom, but irrespective of its class, how was it to float with such a gigantic body? Proportion was a deeply ponderous subject. Its lower body was all but a terrifying example of evolution. Instead of legs there, numerous tentacles, a structure projected out of its lower body. Of its intelligence, I had little clue of. What bothered me the most at first was what I believed was a misrepresentation of the creature's eyes. There were hundreds of those maddening eyes, leering straight down at those helpless people. Hundreds of them, yes. Hundreds or even maybe thousands. I'm not quite sure. For I said the visibility was getting alarmingly low. Even then, the painting wasn't carried out in much detail. Further, as I sauntered on the precarious ledge, now blissfully aware of certain things, more of those harrowing paintings came into view. In some, I swear I thought I even saw wanderers bearing striking similarities to us. No headlamps and modern gear with them. While in some, the monstrosity was being worshipped, and in some of the arts, the figures seemed to defend themselves, throwing pebbles and javelins. But what are these tidbits to a deranged monster like that? At length, I found myself standing across another spectacular find, which fellow researchers and archaeologists like me would have been tempted to explore. For here I am, exempting the tempting details of the find. But now I know what forbade our own workers from working near those figurines. Vile organic liquid covered the entire surface. I found myself uttering curses of unfathomable origins. I'm not talking out of my wits here, for you must see, I even remember our coordinates. I remember every detail of our trip. It's not that I'm going insane or I'm even mildly hallucinating. But believe me when I say that that liquid was some sort of excreta, not from a human, emanating such odor. I have little doubt over its origin. Only further ahead on the cave path did the ominous reality choke my neck, strangling my breath. And only further ahead on the cave path is the reason I forbade anyone from redigging on this land of nebulous horror. Further, as I walked through the squalid floor once again, I would like to remind you that I'm not under any kind of stupor. Neither I was then, nor am I suffering from any drug-induced hallucination. I found the extremity of what is hideous, unpleasant, and unbelievable. At first, I checked my nerves, yes I did. Because sometimes high blood pressure or excessive anxiety, I believe, can induce hallucination as well, but no abnormalities there. I feel no shame in dictating what I did next. The last straw which sent me running down to where I am now, in a dream. I raced back through these same precarious ledges, which earlier I crossed with much perseverance. Better to fall and perish than to suffer endlessly in a cloud of persistent dread. Only if God showed any kind of mercy, I would have perished there and then. Those reasonable among you are free to reason with my statement and comment on my shameful course of a run. Say that I might be overthinking or running parallel with my anxiety, but to say my reaction was anything but involuntary will of course would not do justice. I found myself standing over an abyssal pit, common in these kinds of caves. The sound of that monstrosity, the growling was the loudest there, and the smell was suffocating. What bothered me was the sheer stature of the pit, and the colossal width. Even that is justifiable under lack of proper measuring tools and other instruments, as I had already said numerous times. Visibility was low, so it could have been some sort of wicked illusion. which at first confused me and then sent me racing like a mad hound. There, as I looked into the pit with my flashlight, tiny orb-like things reflected back the light. At first, I thought to flee, for an altogether different reason. Bats. I thought of bats for some peculiar reason, but instead, the cave roofs decided to settle on the pit, and only a singular oddity erased every merciful assumption my deranged mind had to offer. They all blinked simultaneously in sheer unison, unanimously. Once again, I fixated my gaze on the queer abyss it lit up, through hundreds of orbs. At first it had seemed like orbs, and then I applied the vestiges of sanity left in me, just like flashes of tube lights, flashlights even. It blinked again, thousands of flashes at once, like eyes. It blinked. Yes, it blinked like eyes. The paintings, the creature in those hideous paintings, the bane and the saliva all around me. This cave. Is it a cave? Or is it... Once again, the cave erupted with what I can only comprehend as laughter. Plain laughter erupted in the whole of that confined space. Inhuman laughter, of the most animalistic kind, mocking a very distinct human emotion. Happiness. At once, the remnants of what was sanity propelled me through that horrendous course of path. I ran like a mad hound, like some sort of carnivore running behind a fleeting group of prey. Bane is very faint now, and almost ceases here. Even the laughter, although for the noxious smell, I can't utter the same. If only to perish remains of my fate, then it is with a heavy heart and a foreboding fear I derive this hideous conclusion. My return to that accursed pit is imminent, for I must find out whatever plagues these plains, this cave. For the time being, amidst moving shapes, deafening groaning of that nameless entity, and blinding darkness, I will continue to document peculiarities. For now, I must return. The sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Mark 13:25. It was getting late in the evening, that part of dusk where the last hangnail of the sun gets swallowed up by the night, fading into perfect darkness. The stars begin to appear across the sky, twinkling their cosmic beauty over all the people down below as they run through these streets for their lives. Jasmine stood in awe as both the moon and sun fell to earth in the garden of the small city. Their cryptic smiles shone upon the stampede that rushed by, as if sharing a private joke with one another that only they were privy to. Jasmine ran through the crowd as they tore their way in every direction, threatening to sweep her off her feet and trample her without so much as a second thought. Most of the buildings that still stood were covered in flames that quickly spread to those that weren't. She ran over to one of the buildings that still stood and went up the wooden steps. The door was unlocked, and she threw herself in, slamming it shut behind her. She lay against it, breathing heavily while wiping the sweat from her face. She was surprised to see her family. Her older sister lay on the floor, much younger than she should have been, crying with her mother. Her father, who had died a grisly death from stomach cancer, worked an old television with a rotting fist, yelling, "Ah, shit," as he couldn't get anything else but static. If they had noticed Jasmine, they didn't say. She was about to ask what was happening when the rumble began. Soft at first, but then the windows started rattling. It grew until it shattered the glass and anything that wasn't nailed down was toppled to the floor. Outside, a huge wall of flames stretched towards them, swallowing everybody on the street. Bright yellow filled the room as she backed up, and the walls imploded. She felt her body disintegrate into nothing, and then woke up. Jasmine's dreams were always wild, vivid and marvelous, her mother would say. The shock of them would always leave a big impression, but they were nothing new. Now in her 30s, she had had them long enough that they were now inconsequential, like watching a movie. The dark scene replayed in her head for about an hour or so, and then it faded into nothing. The world was going to end, and she already knew that. It was only a month ago since the asteroid had made the news. All across social media, the story of the asteroid heading towards Earth was all that anyone would ever talk about. It was at first played off, scientists and other officials assuring the public that it would only be a near miss, or that it wasn't possibly big enough to do any real damage if it hit. She believed it, wanting desperately to believe it as so many others did. The truth couldn't stay denied, though. A few amateur observers saw the truth and were heavily mocked for being conspiracy theorists and spreading misinformation. Others began to speak up, and soon NASA was even confirming it. The President of the United States convened with other world leaders, and they tried to destroy it with a large arsenal of nuclear warheads. The explosion could be seen from the Earth, but it didn't even put a dent in the monster. The only thing they accomplished was possibly speeding up everybody's death, as radiation peppered down back across the globe. Soon enough, everybody was sick from radiation poisoning, and most of the plant life had withered. The final report that aired was a farewell message from the President of the United States. It more or less said, "So long. We had a good run. Make peace with your loved ones and yourselves because it was game over." The asteroid was supposed to be bigger than the one that had killed the dinosaurs, and it would probably destroy the Earth for good. And the power cut out after that. 4 days left. Jasmine had crossed the days off like a gruesome advent calendar. The 23rd circled in bright red. That was the day that the meteorite was supposed to destroy the world. It was visible during the day now, just a speck in the sky. She did her best to avoid the windows and the direct sunlight, as it made the burns from her radiation sickness even worse, and she made it a point to look at its progress each morning. Most of the people in her apartment complex were gone. It was the way that she had preferred it, as people usually lead to problems and disappointment. There was still a handful, though, which she was thankful for, especially Chris. He was an older fellow who lived a few doors down. Even before the disaster, the two of them would get together once in a while for a game of cribbage. He was a sweet man with a great sense of humor. Although she thought about romance with him once or twice, neither really wanted anything more than to skunk each other if they had happened to be lucky enough that day. And they would toss a few beers back while playing, and Bonnie's German Shepherd would periodically come by to give her a lick on the hand or see if either had a scrap of food to spare. There was a family of 3 that lived across the hallway close to the stairs. The Colemans. Edward and Michelle were a married couple that seemed to argue over anything, and it was usually this arguing that would break Jasmine from her strange dreams. She felt bad for their son Nathan. He was a bright 9-year-old who always looked much sadder than a boy his age should. There was nobody in his generational bracket around anymore, and whenever his parents caught Jasmine trying to talk to him, they would hurry him inside while shooting her a dirty look. Old Mrs. Breyer lived next to the family. She was a quiet old woman who usually kept to herself. It seemed like everybody did these days. Chris once told her that both her husband and her kids had died in a bad car accident. He was drinking and he must have overcorrected, sending the car off a small cliff. She always blamed herself, and over the years her mind began to slip. There used to be a nurse that came by in the mornings and the evenings. As the weeks went by, Jasmine could only assume that she was one of the people that had left town. She wasn't sure why people left. Maybe they thought it couldn't get to them that far up, like some magical force would protect them from the fall of radioactive dust. Or they could just get far enough away to be safe from the impact of the monster in the sky. It frustrated her, but she knew how powerful denial could be. After all, she had denied her family most of her life. There wasn't much of a story there. Her parents split up when she and her sister were young, and neither wanted them. So over time, while growing up with a foster family, she grew to resent them. Food was becoming scarce, and most of the places around them had already been looted, and stepping outside would mean drastically accelerating their sickness. So Jasmine, Chris, and sweet Mrs. Breyer pooled what they had left and rationed it out each night. The Colemans, of course, had snubbed their offer. When they had finished a meal of buttered bread and chips, Jasmine made her way over to Chris's. Before long, she was losing her third game of cribbage against him, gently scratching Bonnie's tummy. Even the dog was in poor shape, as more patches of fur came off each day, exposing bright pink skin below. I kinda wish I had gone, Chris said abruptly. Part of her wanted to be shocked, but she knew how much Bonnie meant to him. She had to have been suffering so badly because of it. Yeah, I know what you mean. It's a cruel way to go out for all of us. Baked to a crisp into our own skin, and then bam, hit over the head by a giant rock. What would you do differently if you knew what was coming? Would you have spent more time with your friends and loved ones? Try to warn the government. Jasmine considered this while looking over her cards. She found it incredible that after all these years of playing and with the apocalypse knocking at the door, that she could still get excited over a good hand. 3 5s and a jack. And then she scoffed, trying to push her sister from her mind. You gotta have friends to spend time with, and my family's a joke. Pretty much everyone that I knew before moving here was already gone. Well, that must have been really hard. I suppose it helps in this case, though, to have nobody to worry over. Yeah, I guess. Maybe I would just get loaded every night and eat until my ass jiggled. She laughed. Her smile turned into a frown when she saw the cut card was a 7. What would you do? Chris let out a sigh and put his finger over the top of his lip. He often did this when he was deep in thought. I suppose I would undo every tie that I ever had. Never would have gotten married or had kids. I also never would have gotten this mangy old mutt, he said, giving her ear a scratch. She wanted to argue for him, to show him the good in all of it, but there wasn't much of a point. He was effectively right. Either that, he spoke again, throwing 2 cards to her crib, or I've always wanted to fly someday. Take me and old Bonnie here across the city, to a faraway place. He said this with a warm smile. As he petted Bonnie's head, more fur came away in his hands. Jasmine could see the pain in his eyes, and it was heartbreaking. Well, we still have time. Maybe we should go to the airport and go for a ride, he said with a smirk. Chris chuckled, and they continued their game, Jasmine losing by 64 points. It was still early in the evening when Jasmine went home. She, along with everyone else, slept more these days. The sickness that ran its course took a lot out of them. Not that there was much else to do anyway. The water no longer worked, but it was so contaminated that it would have been a death sentence to use it, so a shower was out of the question. She settled for just removing her clothes and flopping to the bed. She was close to drifting off too when she heard the angry screaming coming from down the hallway. It was Mrs. Breyer. Frustrated, she threw her dirty, blood-spotted clothes back on and went out to the hall. The door to Mrs. Breyer's apartment was wide open. She made her way over to it and then poked her head in. Mrs. Breyer. She moved further inside and was stunned to see a man she didn't recognize standing over the terrified old woman. The man had clearly been living outside in the city. The skin on his face was mostly gone, leaving only a mask of brown, dried up, leathery meat. Jasmine wasn't even entirely sure that he could blink still. The tip of a long knife rested against the woman's red skin, and Jasmine began to backpedal. He was on her in a flash, squeezing a tight hand around the back of her neck. At this, she jumped, yelping in both fear and pain. "No, please, what do you want?" "Water. You're gonna give me all your goddamned water, or you're gonna get this knife jammed into your face, you got it?" Jasmine nodded as his crazed eyes took her in. They were an ugly yellow, and the muscle that still somehow managed to encase them was an angry shade of red that seemed to be slowly burning towards them. When he talked, she could see several teeth were missing. She thought of her own teeth that had started to become loose the last week, and it scared her. No one was going to be spared. "You get me that water, all of it, or I might just stab her just to put her out of her misery," he growled, pointing the blade to Mrs. Breyer again. "No, please, my apartment's this way," she yelled, pulling him back from his coat. "You can take every bottle that I have, okay? Nobody has to get hurt." She was crying and amazed by it. After all this time, she still didn't want to die. Oh, Mrs. Breyer. He nodded at this, and the two slowly made their way back to Jasmine's door. As she walked through, a loud gasp shot out from behind her. She turned her head and Chris was standing there holding a rolling pin that dripped with blood. The man lay on the floor, a nasty wound on the back of his scalp that leaked what little blood still pumped from inside his body. "Please, I just need water. My daughter, her fever, is gonna die." With a loud roar, he slammed the pin down in his skull again and again. "No, Chris," she pleaded. "You want this asshole getting up again. Don't get suckered by him, he's desperate. There's no daughter." She turned away as he continued raining down blows. Sharp cracks turned into wet thumps until he was sure the man didn't feel a thing. Somewhere out there in the city, possibly the next building over, was a little girl who would die a sad death. She went into her apartment and locked the door where she cried herself into a deep sleep. Jasmine was running down the street that she had grown up on. Ahead of her, a field of skeletons stood in her direction, all of them pointing towards her, jaws open in a noiseless scream. She took a quick look behind her to see a great ball of fire and smoke dropping from the sky. She ran faster as she felt the earth begin to shake, and then the behemoth had touched down. Even as she continued to pump her legs, she was lifted up into the air along with the skeletons. Their screams became audible as they joined hers in a grim chorus. The first thing to hit her was nausea. It quickly rose from the depths of her stomach, and she retched up last night's meager meal. The next thing she noticed was how badly it hurt. It was as though she swallowed a lump of glowing coal that made its permanent home in her core. After a few more dry heaves, she was shocked to see how much blood was on the carpet. Her sickness was getting worse, and at this rate, the radiation might seal the deal before the asteroid. She groaned as she got out of bed. Everything hurt. The glistening blisters on her unnaturally red skin had gotten bigger. She stumbled out to the hall and was surprised that she didn't hear the Colemans. Maybe they had finally worked it out, she decided. She was going towards Mrs. Breyer's to see how she was holding up after last night, when the Coleman's door opened. Chris stepped out, looking surprised to see Jasmine. He was looking about as bad as she felt, as blood seemed to paint his face and arms. "Chris, what's going on? What happened?" He sighed deeply. "It's the Colemans. They passed away last night." Jasmine's eyes widened at this. "What, how? I knew they were sick, but all three in one night." It wasn't the radiation that got him. I think Edward must have finally given in to the futility of it all. At some point he took a knife, stabbed Nate and Michelle, and then did himself in. She felt her tears well up and brought her hands to her face. Chris walked over and put his arms around her. She took a hold of him and sobbed quietly into his shoulder. As the moment ticked by, the door to Mrs. Breyer softly opened. She walked out wearing a robe covered in a mess of red and crept up behind him. Neither of them saw the knife flash out, the very same knife the man from last night had dropped. With startling quickness for a woman her age, she dug the blade deep into his ribs while raving like a banshee, twisting the blade back and forth. "Oh, you'll thank me later, dear," she said, nodding. Once again, she reached back, and as the blade came forward, Jasmine shoved her against the guardrail of the steps. The once sweet old woman screamed as she tumbled down the stairs below. It would have been a relief if she had died there, but she lay at the bottom, howling at the jagged piece of railing that pinned her to the fourth step up. Jasmine went to Chris, putting her hand to his wound. It was wide, and blood seemed to pour between her fingers. "Crazy bitch," he yelled as the two of them struggled to their feet. They made their way over to his apartment, and she set him down at the table they played cards at so many times before. She rifled through his bathroom for first aid supplies and came back with alcohol and gauze. As she poured the stinging liquid, he screamed so loud that it made Bonnie howl in tandem. She hadn't seen Bonnie until now, and she really wished that she hadn't. There was barely any fur left on the poor animal, and bloody bits of her bowel trailed from her bottom. She wasn't going to last much longer. It was clear that none of them were. She busied herself with Chris and pressed the gauze firmly against his wound, taping it up, and she gave Chris a pathetic smile. "If you're done torturing me, I'll take my lollipop now." Jasmine giggled despite her urge to cry. Tears burned a lot more today, she had noticed. Fresh out, I'm afraid. What a world. Suppose I'd settle for a beer then. "There's only 2 left," she called from the kitchen. "I can go out and try to find more." "Well, ain't that a bitch? Don't worry about it. I've been meaning to quit drinking anyway, and this seems like as good an opportunity as any. You can deal me in a game, though." She quickly grabbed the cards and set up the board, and then the two played cribbage for the rest of the day. That night, Jasmine stayed with Chris at his apartment. Mrs. Breyer shouted on and off, but Jasmine couldn't bring herself to go out there. Before long, she was in a faraway land where everything appeared as a Renaissance painting. Men with shining armor rode upon mighty horses. They were off to slay some fantastical beast when, up in the sky, a large diamond star fell to the earth. When it touched down upon the mottled ground, it sent men and horses alike off in every direction, setting them ablaze. Flames spread out and quickly ate through the picturesque setting, consuming everything until there was only darkness and the scent of death. When she opened her eyes, she felt her skin was wet and slick. Blood was now beating out of the wounds that grew upon her burning skin, and the smell was putrid. She cried as she struggled to get to her feet and looked around. She didn't see Chris or Bonnie anywhere. A small trail of blood, most likely left by Bonnie, led out the door. She followed it out to the hallway, noticing the smell of death was stronger out here. Mrs. Breyer was silent and would be forevermore. A trail of gore continued to the rooftop, and she opened the door where she saw the two sitting on the ledge. "Chris, what are you doing? Get back in here," she yelled, knowing how much worse the levels of radiation were out in the open. He didn't respond, only waved a hand back toward her. She briefly considered going back in, but what was the point now? The pinprick in the sky was much larger now, like a small moon in the morning sky. The sunlight made her already fiery skin burn even hotter, but still she walked out toward her old friend. "Chris." "Jasmine," he replied, half turning to her. My God, Chris, she cried. His exposed face and arms had the appearance of a rotting corpse. Nose, ears, and lips were mostly gone, and as he tried in vain to pet his dog, it was obvious that he was now blind. Bonnie was just as bad. How long have you been up here? We came out last night. Didn't think it would be this bad. It doesn't matter. We still get to fly at least once. He chuckled painfully. If you stay to the end, give the big rock a kick in the ass for me, huh? Before she had time to react, he leaned his ruined body forward and went off the side of the roof, and he pulled Bonnie with him, and she heard these sickening thuds below. She couldn't bear to look, and she ran back to her apartment, now the only person left. Her condition was already bad, but by the time she spent on the roof, it did her no favors either. She slept off and on for the rest of the day, thinking about Chris. She thought about her neighbors, how she would never see anyone again. She thought about the man who would kill just to get his daughter some water. And then she thought about her own family. She found that as much as she denied them in her life, as much as she tried to block them out, she missed them deeply and wanted nothing more than to be with them one last time. Mercifully, no dreams haunted her that night. When she awoke on the final day, she had to unstick the blanket from her skin. A froth of blood and flesh coated her bedding, and her scream was weak as she sat up. Outside, the tempest of wind was savagely blowing, sending large pieces of debris through the city. The end was finally here and she was alone. As she struggled to make her way to the hall, something in her stomach gave out. Blood began to seep down her legs, and she found that she no longer could throw up. She continued her way up to the rooftop, her wet, sticky feet slapping against the floor with each agonizing step. Throwing the door open, she was met with a gray, cloudy sky. The wind was of hurricane proportions, and off in the distant horizon, the great, burning harbinger of death filled the sky, blocking out the sun. It was larger than she could have ever dreamed of, and so close, she felt that she could almost reach out and touch it. She shakily sat down on the ledge where she last had talked to Chris. Jasmine wasn't going to take the easy way out. She spent too long fighting to give in to this monster. The wind grew ever stronger, but she sat there smiling, thinking of all the loved ones she would soon see again. The earth gave a teeth-jarring shake as it touched down. Light filled her vision as a great roar ripped away all sound. At least I won't be alone now, was her final thought before heading into oblivion. There's a reason why I don't eat fruits and vegetables anymore and why I left our town. It all started when a preacher came to our place with seeds and lectured about how it gives more honor to our departed loved ones to plant fruits and vegetables on their graves, rather than just burying them. In a way, it's as if we're still taking care of them, taking care of the plant and our loved ones, and most importantly, taking care of God's creations. The preacher warmly uttered amongst the crowd of people inside that tent. It wasn't long before the townsfolk did just that. Moved by the preacher's words, the once empty land near the woods and near our house served as the burial and planting area. Soon, the fruits and vegetables started to grow. Tomatoes were the first ones to be planted, and the taste was beyond amazing. The bearings were so plump, thick, and they tasted like meat. The other fruits followed, and they tasted sweeter than honey. It was like drinking ambrosia, the drink of the gods. A single seed held so much harvest that it was more than enough for a family of 3. There was no need for currency, for what was sown was shared in our town. At first, I didn't mind, even though I did find it weird, especially when winter came and the crops were still growing and bearing harvest. When I voiced my concern to my parents, they simply told me that it was God's miracle. The town kept eating and eating the crops as if their hunger had become insatiable. It came to a point where fights broke out because no one was willing to share anymore since the food had started to become scarce and there were no bodies to be buried. So they all agreed on the only solution left: bury the living. Rudy, the town drunk, was the first victim since he had no family left due to his abusive nature. I saw how they dragged him to his grave from my window on the second story, and his screams were visceral. I went to bed, covering my ears with my pillow because even though Rudy was deep in the ground, the wind still carried his cries. I looked out my window the next day and saw that a plant had already sprung from Rudy's grave, and by that afternoon, it was raging with harvest. That was the moment I accepted that this was not a work of God. A community dinner was held that night, and we all got a taste of the plant from the drunken man's grave. The folks started to cry from happiness after the plant had touched their tongues, and some started singing praises. I wanted to cry too, not from happiness but from disgust. I pushed myself to purge what I had eaten that night to the point where my throat got sore, and my knuckles scratched from the forceful way they had ground at my teeth. That next night, I planned on skipping food, but my father rested his revolver on the table and said, "Don't make me bury you." My eyes darted to my mother for help, but she was too busy munching on her salad with a smile on her face. I figured that I had lost her too. And so I ate and then purged again. It continued for a month until Rudy's grave gave no more harvest. Another person was given the same treatment as Rudy, and 5 more followed until the paranoia got so bad that people only left their houses with weapons to gather the harvest. The slaughter of animals started to become neglected and unwanted. Some died in their pens, and some broke out of theirs and roamed the streets, and people just ignored them. It's as if they had become the free humans and us, the caged pigs. Everyone was willing to put up a fight, not wanting to be the next one buried. So they all had once again decided on another solution: to bury strangers from someplace else. Brandon Sully was tasked to pick up hitchhikers since he was good looking and held a trustworthy face. He brought 10 strangers within a month. Phoebe Daniels seduced men from out-of-town diners. She brought 20 within a month. Other townsfolk were tasked too since their hunger knew no boundary. No one complained. They were deaf to the pleas of mercy from the strangers, and soon, our community was flourishing with crops. Some discoveries were made about the taste of the crops from the graves of strangers. The meatier the person, the more delicious the bearings get. Soon, our butcher shop no longer held animal meat inside the display window. It held humans. Crying humans bound by hand and feet, hanging for our townspeople to choose from. Of course, they didn't come for free. The meatiest human held the higher price, so the people worked and worked just to have the taste that they craved for. Some died from overexhaustion, so the town buried them, and the harvest from their graves were not sold but instead shared. If you ask me, the people in my town had already paid the price. As the consumption of the plants continued, people started to forget about the basic tasks like bathing and brushing their teeth. It got so bad that they would often piss and shit on the streets, not caring about anything or anyone. I don't even want to talk about what happened to the toddlers and the babies. Sometimes, they would mate on the roads too. That was the day I decided to leave town. My parents were no longer my parents. They were just ravenous beasts that no longer communicated. They just ate. I pleaded for my mother to come with me, but all I got in response were her gibberish words as she salivated while scavenging the fridge for more food. And so I left her. I had no choice. I walked the streets littered with human and animal waste and people who only looked like people but had become something else. As I was nearing the line outside of town, the preacher emerged from the side woods and asked, "Where are you going, little piggy?" I ran as fast as I could as the preacher shouted, "You should have went to the market." I got away and entered another town where I asked for help. I was so shaky and my voice so strained from explaining that the authorities decided to check on my town and found nothing. I insisted on checking again and tagged along and really did find nothing. No community, no people, no houses, just an empty surface of land. I begged them to remember that my town did exist, telling them the name over and over. But it seemed like the preacher did something to their memories and I was left to suffer with mine. That was the price that I had to pay. It's been 10 years since the disappearance of my town. I'm 23 now and I grew up in this new place, taken in back then by a kind couple who had no children. I wish no horror ever befalls your town as it done to mine. I'm slowly accepting the reality that I had lost my town, and I'm slowly healing in this new one that I found. Please, if a man ever comes to your place bearing fruits and vegetable seeds, cast him out. I was eating meat during my break at this diner that I work in when a man, whose appearance remained the same despite the years that had passed, slid into the booth in front of me and smiled at the sudden widening of my eyes as he asked, "Pigs really do eat everything, huh? Tell me, how do your parents taste?" I ran out of that place in the hopes of escaping the hell that followed, only to be greeted by the sight of my adopted mother holding a pack of seeds. "Do you know the Muffin Man?" "Go ahead, you can say the next 2 lines to yourself." "Okay, good job." "Yes, do you know the Muffin Man? He does not live on Drury Lane, however, he lives in your nightmares." Let me explain because this might be somewhat confusing. The Muffin Man is not a Freddy Krueger type entity. He doesn't invade your sleep cycle, and he also doesn't target your specific fears or anything like that. He's very real. Let me be clear. I have never seen him, but I've seen what he has done. My mom made sure that I knew the real story of the children's nursery rhyme. It most likely saved my life. And I hope this saves your life too. As a child, I would say my first solid set of memories came when I was between 3 to 5. It's hard to say, right? Maybe that's late in life to start remembering things. I'm sure you can look up when the average age that memories develop. I don't have that kind of determination though. One memory always stuck with me from an early age. Again, I'm not sure how early, but it feels like it's one of my first verified memories. My mother did her best. My father died when I was an infant in some kind of work accident. She would never expand on that, not even to this day. I'm almost 40 years old now, so it's been a very long time since she's kept a real story for me. I could probably do some digging myself, but again, I'm just not that determined. Maybe it's better to just not know some things. My mother made sure that I knew the most absolute truth of the Muffin Man, though. As much truth as she could convey. Speaking of my mom, same old story. She's a single mother raising multiple kids and did odd job after odd job. She had met some unsavory characters, fell into deep depression, and gained some kind of drug or alcohol dependency problem. Congrats, kid. You got yourself another long road to success or failure, depending solely on you with no guidance from 2 solid parental units. She was a sweet woman though. Even with all of her faults, I always knew she had the light of the sun inside of her. She was never abusive to me or my brothers, and she never yelled. She was just beaten down by life. And the biggest shame is that I was never old enough to really see that. But I was old enough to develop my first memory, possibly before her life took a sharp left and then a hard drop. I think we can all agree as people that human memory isn't at all perfect. I've heard that every time you remember something, it gets distorted just a bit. So, you remember your 10th birthday 1,000 times, and what does that mean? Your memory of that day is some kind of mutated amalgamation of what happened, and what you think happened. I don't know, but I'll say it again. I don't care that much to know. I do care that I remember singing and playing the Muffin Man with my mother. Every time I remember this, it is exactly the same. The sunlight is streaming in through the window behind her. Her raven black hair is as straight and beautiful as Sacagawea. We're both sitting, me in my lumpy childlike way, her cross-legged. She didn't have a great singing voice, but hearing her sing the Muffin Man song fills me with warmth. Even after what I had learned, I can't remember if there was a patty cake type game that accompanied the rhyme. It feels like there is, but that's where my memory ends. I brought this up to my mom a few times. She can't remember this at all. She knows the rhyme and admits that she's saying this to all of us boys, but it was no more than that. No patty cake, no enthusiasm, just a motherly way to entertain her children. The last time that I saw her, she looked bad. She was well beyond her years now in a bad way. I wanted to go back to this nursery rhyme, one of my earliest and most pure memories. We always talked about singing the Muffin Man together when I was very young. What she said this time changed my life. Yeah, I remember, she slurred. Damn, Mom, I can't even start the conversation off without slurring. It's like 10 in the morning. It just makes me notice again how bad she looks. Well, all of our conversations are like this now. The 5 or 6 that we have a year. Yeah, Mom, you know I always loved hearing you sing that to me. She seemed to have a flash of sobriety on her face. I ever tell you and I was losing her again. The real story of the pastry, the thing. Muffin Man, yeah, the Muffin Man. I ever tell you? Holy shit, she's really out of it tonight. Looks like this might be a short visit. I took a moment to look at my mother, the woman that gave birth to me. At this moment, I saw the 30-year-old version of her. Smooth, tan skin and jet black hair, and a smile that lasted for an eternity. As that facade faded, the current version revealed itself once again. Glazed eyes, subtle spitting forming from the side of her mouth, a human form of defeat. She looked down, seemingly because she was shutting down, but she raised her head, and a moment of clarity followed. You don't know the Muffin Man because I didn't want you to. He ruins everything he touches for nothing more than pure enjoyment. He'll do it to anyone. I don't mean to be sexist either. There are probably female muffin women. They prey on many targets. They are legion, and they are real. He is real. I waited for her next confounding sentence, but maybe after 20 seconds I realized my mother had passed out. Or blacked out, I couldn't be sure. Her eyes were slightly opened and she was breathing, but life had left her for the moment. That was the most lucid 3 or 4 sentences I've heard from her in the last half a decade. I thank the universe for at least giving me that. I gently guided her unconscious body down on the couch that she was sitting on and covered it with a nearby blanket. The tactile feel of this blanket was questionable at best. I left her shitty apartment complex and opened my phone. I sent both my brothers one simple message. Still insane. And I walked to my car. When I arrived at my modest rancho in the valley, I finally checked my phone and saw I had absolutely 0 responses from my brothers, or anyone else. That night I slept for maybe 24 minutes. I had visions of muffins, blood, and violence. I got out of bed determined when the sun broke the horizon for the first time in many, many moons. I finally found myself a mission, and I attacked the internet like a man that had not slept for 24 minutes in the last few days. I knew where to start, but didn't know where to end. My poor mother was only clear about one thing in the last decade. The Muffin Man was bad. He, she, they are killers. She didn't remember the fun nursery rhyme as much as the killer connotations that it meant. I searched everything I could, and I came up with freaking nothing. Well, not nothing, but not much that I could use. From what I've gathered, the classic song could have come from an actual baker from the 1600s in London. He or they could have lived on Drury Lane, which does actually exist. The Muffin Man probably served or delivered English muffins, not the sweeter, plumper version that we Americans imagine. He could also, or she, you know what, I'm just going to refer to the entity as the Muffin Man like I have been, just to avoid confusion on my end. He could also be a ragamuffin, a vagabond or a vagrant, a society outlier. In other words, he might not be a baker at all, but a dangerous man with no home, no consequences, and no responsibilities. Something doesn't feel right. My left arm fell off the table. I tried to keep typing, finally noticing that only my right arm remained on the computer. As I was trying to mentally move it back to the table, my vision blurred. The darkness was coming. As hard as I fought it, it was. Do you know the... Both my brothers are staring at me. Guys, I'm glad you came over. You made good time, I said. You didn't invite us, my oldest brother said. I laughed. Well, you're both here and you wouldn't be if I didn't ask you to hang out. Neither of you guys ever asked me if I want to come over. No, he said, you didn't. And we're not in your house. We're in the hospital, bro. At this moment, I realized I was lying down in an uncomfortable bed, only slightly more uncomfortable than the one at home. There was a lot of white here, and that would explain it. After having a pretty decent conversation with my brothers, they informed me that I had what the medical professionals call a cerebrovascular accident, a stroke to me and you. I, along with most of you, I'm sure I thought I was too young to get a stroke. That's for old people. Well, it turns out that about 10% of adults under 45 get them, so I'm cool and unlucky. I was lucky though. I had little to no permanent brain damage, and I also did not forget my memories of the Muffin Man. I had to talk to my mother again immediately. After some doctor-ordered bed rest, I felt good enough to finally drive. I was feeling better. I thankfully had a waterfowl-endorsed insurance plan that covered me quite handsomely while I was out of work. I had rediscovered my love of working out through physical therapy, and I also was reading more to work my brain out. Not to mention it was also Christmas time. Even though today it is a balmy 80 degrees in Southern California, the Christmas feel is the same as it is in a snowy climate. I've always loved this time of year. I've decided that I'm going to kidnap my mom. Would that be mom napping? Either way, I'm going to take her from her apartment, forcibly if I must. I will then drive her straight to Palm Springs and throw her in the Monarch Shores Rehabilitation Facility. I know this place will work, as the middle brother in our family got clean there. Middle children, right? Her apartment complex always reminded me of the one Daniel LaRusso moved into in the first Karate Kid. The building was a big U-shape with 2 stories. A biohazard pool sat in the middle, for all the residents to enjoy. I walked up to the second level towards 211. Her door was visible as soon as you got to about the 4th or 5th stair from the top. I could already see that it was slightly open. I'm going to save you most of the details because I cannot bear to write them down. I'm sorry, I truly am. I'll give my best. Too long didn't read summary for the internet crowd reading this. My mom is dead. I don't know how long. The police are still investigating, but it couldn't have been that long as I'd imagined a housekeeper or other staff member would have noticed her door was open. At the very least, someone would have smelled the unmistakable odor of death if she had been there for more than a few days. The room was covered in blood. Among the plasma, I discovered a note which I kept. I know that I tampered with the crime scene and could possibly be charged with some type of obstruction, but I could not leave the authorities with this evidence. It's not evidence. It's for me and not the state. It was short, and I'll just leave you with the most important part. Son, he's here. I'm sorry that I couldn't tell you everything. It's not your father, he's dead. That much is true. It wasn't an accident. He died trying to defend me. Your brothers were not here and you were in my belly when it happened. I think I broke when I saw him die. I never should have sung that song over and over to you. The Muffin Man will be coming for you next. God bless you, my little boy. I hope that you never know the Muffin Man. I'm sitting here in my dark room. I just buried what was left of my mother. I couldn't bring myself to tell my own brothers what had happened. Just another senseless murder is all I could come up with. The cops tried their best, but in the end, they just didn't have enough to go on. Maybe they know it would have helped. Maybe one day I'll hand it over and risk prosecution. Maybe. I don't know how she saved my life by singing this Muffin Man song to me. Maybe I'll never know. I'm tired. I don't know where to go next. I don't know what to do next. The only thing I know is that I'm going to walk down to Ralph's grocery store. I'm going to toast up some English muffins and sing myself a little rhyme.